Thanks everyone so much for joining us for this workshop co-sponsored by the North Atlantic Fire Science Exchange, the USDA Forest Service, and the University of Vermont. And I hope I'm not forgetting anybody major. We have a lot of wonderful speakers that are part of this today. So thank you everybody for being here. I do need to say that when Kevin Dodds first came to NAFC, the Fire Science Exchange, and said, I'd really like to update folks in this region about what's going on with southern pine beetle. We thought of about 30 people off the top of our head that we really, really wanted to be here. And it turns out everyone has invited their friends, and we're really excited that all of you are here for today's workshop. So the goal of today's virtual workshop is to help folks make practical plans and also to establish a community of practice around pitch pine barren management in light of southern pine beetle. Participants are going to use the resources for developing management plans for at-risk pitch pine stands across the northeastern US and share information about applications of thinning and prescribed fire. So for the rest of this hour, we're going to be focusing on the current state of the problem. So Kevin Dodds is going to give us an overview of southern pine beetle detections in New England and kind of share with us a map of spread and explain how worried we should be and outline some reasons for taking action. So Kevin Dodds is a forest entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service and was the guy who called us for help here. So we're really excited that he's going to kick us off, sharing the current state of the problem. Go ahead, Kevin.
All right. Thank you, Amanda, and thanks to everyone for coming out today. It's great to see so much interest in the topic, and there's been a lot of work over decades in pitch pine management, and it's exciting to sort of build off of that, form a community around this and move forward with that. And I want to thank Amanda and Virginia and Tony for helping get all of this together. Certainly joining with NAFC was the right idea because Virginia and Amanda have sort of taken this idea that we had kind of to the next level. So really excited about today and then where we might go after this as well. We're kind of fortunate in the Northeast where we don't really have any significant bark beetle issues. Every now and then, something like spruce beetle or eastern larch beetle will pop up on the landscape and become a little bit of an issue, but we don't have this sort of landscape events where you have a lot of tree mortality. And that's good news, but on the other hand, we just don't have the experience with managing bark beetles and having to incorporate them into forest management plans on the back end of any plans, maybe conducting salvage operations. And so that kind of like infrastructure mindset's not really incorporated into our plans. We just really haven't had to do it, unless maybe sometimes you would address something like Ips species in slash in a stand if you were worried about that jumping into living trees. But again, that's not something that is we really worry about too much. But this all sort of changed in 2014 with southern pine beetle arriving in New York, and you can see on this figure that pretty much since 2015 when the aerial surveys first started, we've had a lot of southern pine beetle activity on Long Island, and it's been consistent through the years since then. And really, New York had to build up a southern pine beetle program from nothing. There was nobody working on it up here. Everybody in DEC already had other commitments on other insects and diseases and things like that. And so really, that staff had to take on dealing with southern pine beetle. And from that point on, there's been a consistent program that involved detection, suppression on Long Island. And that will continue. That will continue with other states as southern pine beetle spreads. And I think too, a lot of times when we talk about these hard pine pests in the Northeast, they're almost kind of dismissed, like, well, we just don't have much hard pine to worry about. But the truth is, of course, and we all know this, that, pitch pine is common, and in some areas it's the dominant, pine species. And so there are some larger tracts of pitch pine, and certainly New Jersey has a lot. I do think these estimates are probably a little bit lower. The authors kind of acknowledge that in their work, but certainly on New York, on Long Island alone, there's more acreage in coastal pitch pine barrens than this graph suggests. But it gives us a good idea of how much is out there. And so Massachusetts has a lot. New York. When you move into the inland pine barrens, they're more rare. There's some larger tracts, what we you can think of hundreds of acres to over 1,000. But then there's also these really isolated stands that I think are particularly at risk, because if the beetle moves through there, they may only be 50, 100 acres, 75 acres, and the beetle could do a lot of damage in those stands, and then they're just lost because there's a lot of other issues we'll talk about later. But anyway, so these inland pine barrens, while the acreage total isn't significant, they are ecologically significant and they're important regionally. So I wanted to show the distribution kind of as we know it today anyways. The gray part of the map are states where we have had infested trees. The red are states where we've detected southern pine beetle. And then I overlaid the 2021 southern pine beetle detections. So that occurred last fall. That kind of, were one of the reasons we got on having this meeting as well, because I look at these as like an early warning system. And so the key thing to know about the traps is they don't necessarily mean that you have an infestation in that area or adjacent to the traps. So, in Maine and New Hampshire, the likely scenario is that beetles are existing there at very low levels. They might, they're probably using stress trees, maybe build up the population a little bit during the summer, but then get knocked back by cold temperatures. And so they just haven't been able to get to a point with the climate releasing them to a point where they can cause a lot of damage. But the good news for us, right, is that these traps give us an idea of like, okay, it's probably time to start thinking about managing in these areas because southern pine beetles are at least testing the habitat. And so the furthest north that I know of anyways of infested trees is based off of work by New York DEC. New York DEC also ran all of these traps, of course, but you can see, and I guess parks also run some of those traps, but the furthest north of that infested trees have been found was at this Sunset Rock site. And I think there were 3 trees there that were infested. They were cut out in the fall or early winter anyway. So we don't know if those beetles would have made it through the winter or not. But I think it ties in well with our trapping information where, again, we know the beetles were in the area. They were now in trees there for sure, killed trees, and probably some portion of that population would have made it through the winter. So it was smart to get the trees down and destroy the brood in there just to stop that spot from forming anymore. So we worked with Columbia University to model when climate would become available. And so southern pine beetle has never been habitat limited. There's a lot of pine in the north that southern pine beetle could have been exploiting all along. But because of climate change, the beetle's been released into new areas. It is freeze intolerant, so it gets beat back during the winters. But as climate's warm, more habitat's becoming available. Excuse me. And so if you look at this map, there's these ISO lines are 2020, 2050 is kind of the key one for today. And again, remember, so this isn't detection. This is about when habitat becomes suitable over the years, so populations will be able to persist there. So if you follow that 2050 line, you think about the Waterboro and the Ossipee spines are within that area. And so it looks like, beetles are now at least testing that habitat. Getting killed back during the winter is, I think, the clear scenario. But we're probably a little bit ahead of, what we thought with the model, that maybe that area wouldn't be really suitable until 2050. We might be a little bit ahead of that by now. When you look at the 2080 ISO line, that's really when things start to open up. Pretty much all of New England becomes suitable then, but also Ontario, and you move into those Midwestern, more commercial red pine stands that could be at risk. So, I don't think I'm a person that overestimates what native insects can do to native forests, but southern pine beetle does threaten the persistence of pitch pine in the Northeast. And what I mean by that, we're not gonna see an elimination of pitch pine on the landscape or anything like that. But some of those spatially isolated stands are really at risk. And then there's going to be a lot of changes in other stands, especially the ones that aren't managed. And And if you've been working on pitch pine, a lot of this is old news. You know, there's a lot of unmanaged stands on the landscape where limited mechanical treatment, probably no prescribed fire whatsoever. That's led to mesification, densification. So you have these stands that are really on a trajectory to change completely from what we think about with pitch pine and pitch pine barrens. There's also limited regeneration, and so there's nothing coming up when we lose that overstory. And now we have a rapid overstory event with southern pine beetle coming through, or the possibility of a rapid overstory event. And just to run through that scenario, this is some work from Molly Hoist, who did her master's in Tony D'Amato's lab. The number of seedlings that are on the Y. We've got the treatments are control sites, unmanaged southern pine beetle infestations, and managed southern pine beetle infestations. So it doesn't have to do with forest management per se. The darker bars are pitch pine, and you can see, you know, there's almost nothing in these treatments. These were sites across Long Island. I think it was, I don't know, 16 or 18 sites were sampled, and Molly just didn't really find very much pitch pine regen at all. And again, I mean, this is something that a lot of people have documented over the years. And you know, it's bad news, but still people visiting those sites may think they're relatively healthy forests. There's an overstory of pine still, and there's could be hope still that there'd be some restoration in those stands or some thinning. But the problem now is when southern pine beetle rolls through, things can change really quickly. And this is a size class distribution from one of Molly's sites, and the maroon bars are pitch pine overstory, and you can see the largest structure in the stand are pitch pine, but it's the most important tree, or it was the most important tree in the stand. This was a 70-acre site, I think, and just after it was a summer, but late summer, fall, so just a couple months, this was the resulting size class distribution that was left. So we lost 99% of the pitch pine was lost in that stand. And so you can see, you know, you've lost all of the larger structure. There's significant changes. You have a lot of standing, in this case, standing dead wood and trees that were cut down, dead trees that were cut down still on the ground because nothing was removed from these sites. So, you know, you've lost your seed source. You've opened up that canopy, of course, and now you have no regen in those stands either to sort of move into those other size classes. So it can be a very rapid change if management isn't undertaken to try to build resiliency in these stands. In terms of host trees, we know pitch pine, that's why we're here today. Pitch pine's a great host. Southern pine beetle has a history with it in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland. And then red pine, you know, not something we're really worried about just because in southern New England, it's eliminated for the most part by red pine scale and other factors. And that's also occurring in parts of northern New England too. Still, you know, fairly important in parts of New York and some parts of Maine too, but not something right now that's adjacent to areas where we have infested pitch pine stands. Jack pine, I think, will be a great host. It hasn't, as far as we know, it hasn't encountered, or southern pine beetle hasn't encountered jack pine yet, but you know, the way that those stands develop and the structure of them that results, I think, would be really conducive to maintaining an infestation. So I assume jack pine will be a good host. Yeah, we get a lot of questions about white pine, and white pine is a documented host that has maintained an infestation in the Southeast. It's not common, of course, and it's not common on Long Island, but the times that we've seen it, this is pretty typical where you have a white pine that's hit pretty hard. All of these resin globs are attack points. But when you cut into the tree and you look at the gallery, you look at gallery success and larval success, this is pretty typical where you get a lot of resinosis, some failed galleries, some successful. You have some early larvae feeding here, but they get to some point and they just kind of peter out. And we're not really sure what the mechanism is for that. It could be fungal, it could be host defenses, and it certainly warrants somebody looking at it more. But right now, we don't feel that white pine's particularly at risk. So I was trying to come up with a way to summarize all of the work we've been doing. And I've been using we very collectively during this talk, and it's going to continue with this figure because there's been just a ton of people that have been involved in this program. I probably left some people off, and I apologize if I did, but it really has been a pretty large community of people, tackling this. And so we were fortunate to be able to build off of a lot of the work in the Southeast too. So if you look at this figure, essentially the red boxes are an IPM program. we used what the South had developed and then modified it here. And so if you think about detection and monitoring, we're using survey traps. We're not really worried about monitoring anymore. We're totally focused on detection, trying to pick up these new areas as they get close to being open habitat. We've learned some things to modify trapping, surveying in the fall. This fall and next year we'll be working to optimize the pheromones with a group from the Southeast for detection, because in the past they've been optimized for monitoring. Suppression, New York got a suppression program up and running really quickly, to their credit. We relied on some winter cutting, which I think our colleagues in the Southeast may have been against a little bit, but we were hoping at that time to get trees on the ground, open them up, and kill off as much brood as possible, because our stands or our spots are more isolated than what you might see in the Southeast. So Jeff did some great work on looking at winter survival. I tried to look at survival on down trees, but it was a failed experiment because of a warm winter. But there's still some information we need to figure out about suppression and how effective it is, but it looks like it's working really well for New York. And then prevention is why we're here today, right? And this is maybe the one, it's probably the only time in my career anyways, and I think it's going to be the same for most people, is where, two objectives are parallel in this. And so working towards, building resiliency in pitch pine stands and lowering susceptibility to southern pine beetle really parallels with all of the restoration effort that people have been doing for decades and trying to get incorporated over larger parts of the landscape. So it's a great situation where we can, knock out two things at the same time. Elizabeth Jamison is going to talk about a hazard model that she developed later today, and that's been an important development for us to have something that we can use out on the landscape. John Nowak, who's also going to talk, will touch probably on some of the hazard model guidance that they've used in the South to prioritize landscapes for thinning. And then we're just beginning a regional assessment of pitch pine that a lot of people on this call are on this attending this workshop are part of. And then we're hoping with all of this that we're going to be able to lay out kind of a scientifically sound approach to going and trying to get funding for some larger region-wide treatments for if people are interested in it, where we'd really be able to prioritize the landscape and have a nice kind of roadmap towards getting some funding to get some stands that are unmanaged under some management plans. And then finally, restoration. Either southern pine beetles causing a lot of chaos, or we're causing some chaos by going in and suppressing southern pine beetle. And then we're mostly walking away to go to other sites and move on to other areas that have southern pine beetle. And so restoration is an important component of that we need to build into a lot of this. And we're starting a project on pitch pine regen. And then we have, and this thinning box could have probably gone up at prevention, but we've established thinning and prescribed fire demo for us, and the Long Island breakout room later. I'll talk about this with Holly and John. And those are important. We're already getting some good information out of them. We have them on Long Island. Dave Crary worked really hard the last couple of years before he retired at getting some sites in on the Cape too. So we'll get more and more information out of those as the years go on. So I mentioned the studies. We have two studies that we're working on now. So it's me and Tony D'Amato, and then a lot of other folks that are partnering with us. And the first one is that region-wide assessment of pitch pine conditions. And then we'll also have a project starting to develop a pitch pine regeneration guide. And so if anybody attending the workshop has some sites that they manage or don't manage that are in pitch pine, we'd be interested in talking to you about incorporating those sites into either one or both of these projects. So I think maybe the best way would be to type your email or contact or something in the box, and we'll try to keep track of that. So that is everything I have. I hope I came in under time, Amanda.
That was amazing, Kevin. Thank you so much for that. And I appreciate that even though it started with a little bit of bad news, that we picked it up with focusing on the community that can do something about this. So thank you so much for that. We'd love to get questions from folks in the audience. We have about a little over 10 minutes. You were fast, Kevin. So we have time to take some questions from folks in the audience. So please, just because we have so many people, type your question into the chat window and we will do our best to address it in the time that we have. And I'm sure Kevin or anyone else in our kind of speaker panel here would be happy to help answer it. So questions on the current state of the problem or on anything else that you heard. Oh, here comes some questions. So Justin is asking, he says, thank you for that overview. Have you worked with Northeast Heritage programs to identify pitch pine sites for the region-wide assessment?
Yeah, that's a good question. A little bit. So certainly, so New York right now, and Jess is going to talk next, I think, but she won't cover this. But Jess and her lab has been working with New York Heritage, I believe, to get us some different sites in New York, some sites that had been previously sampled in the 90s we want to revisit. I haven't tied in with Massachusetts yet or anything. We have some sites in Massachusetts that will be on Miles Standish hopefully this summer. So yeah, any good ideas on sites we would be open to adding for sure.
Awesome. Thanks for the question, Justin, and thanks for the response, Kevin. And you have a volunteer already. Jake McCumber is saying, Kevin, Camp Edwards is a great Cape Cod site for region-wide assessment and pitch pine region. And he gave his email, and I can definitely make sure you get it. You have another question. Hi, Kevin. This is Sandy Spencer at Patuxent Research Refuge in Maryland. We have pitch pine oak stands on the refuge that we believe are remnant pine barrens on sandy soils. We conduct prescribed fire there. We'd be interested in having this site as part of your research group on pitch pine barrens, management, prevention, restoration. So another great connection. And so I think Kevin was giving a yes, that'd be awesome. So Justin is also following up. Northeast Heritage programs track pitch pine sites. Pitch pine is a G3 habitat tracked by all Northeast Heritage programs, including managed and unmanaged lands, and probably have the best info on locations for sites. So thank you for that, Justin. All right, we still have time for questions. I'm sure you have questions on what the heck is the current state of the problem here with pitch pine.
And I will say to Jake really quick, we do have you listed, Jake. I just haven't had a chance to reach out to you yet. And then Sandy, I'll get in touch. You know, we're mostly Northeast, but I grew up in Maryland, so and I do go down there every now and then. So maybe we could fit in some sampling there too, or at least a site visit. So thank you for that.
All right, we have a couple more questions that came in. One, Jerry Carlson is asking, what is the role of natural enemies? And I do want to mention, I added a fact sheet that Kevin put together. It was in the pre-reading, but I also just dropped it into the chat for your quick reference. So, so Jerry's question, what is the role of natural enemies?
Yeah, I mean, they're important. There's, you know, predaceous beetles. There's one species in particular that arrives at the trees and feeds on attacking adults, and then also feeds on the developing brood. And so, you know, they're common. You see them on the trees. There's parasitoids that, you know, are also important. You know, based on information in the Southeast, they're all very important. And there's also not just natural enemies, but competition is really important with other bark beetles and cerambycids. And so I think, you know, in the Northeast, we don't really have a good handle, and there's definitely no estimates of, you know, whatever percent mortality from A, B, or C, but they're out there, and I assume, you know, I wouldn't say regulating the population and keeping it below damage, but they're out there hitting some of those populations for sure.
Great, thank you for that. Let's see, so you're getting more contact info in the chat, which is excellent. And Brian Hawthorne has a question. He says, Kevin, do we have information on the annual dispersal distance of SPB individuals?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, the thought is that, so in the spring, the beetle is has more fat and is more inclined to disperse out. Once a spot is formed, they pretty much just stay within that spot, so it'll be very short dispersal. But those early and then late season dispersal, again, they can disperse pretty far. I don't remember offhand there is a paper that looked at the distance. I want to say, 70 or 80% of the beetles were under a mile away or something like that. So it's not thought to be long range just based on flight ability, but they disperse up and then get pulled by or pushed by wind as well. So you can get, beetles, going 15, 20 miles without much problem, just based on wind.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a related question, I think, from John Mitchell, who says, what's the range of sites that are considered isolated? How many acres or just distance? Maybe the question I'm asking is how large an area tends to be knocked out from a bad infestation that pops up?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And, southern pine beetle infestation or spot can be 5 or 10 trees, or it can be thousands of trees, and so the site that we saw completely, converted on Wertheim was 70 acres, and those trees were all knocked out. So in the south, you can get, thousands of acres affected by southern pine beetle. So it just depends on what the populations is out there at the time, and some other stand conditions that allow the populations to build, because it is, I didn't spend any time really on the biology, but there's multiple generations per year, and those spots just continue to grow.
Great or not so great. Thanks for that, Kevin. Chris Beetle is asking, is there a concern about accelerated mesification with the cut and leave method?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. We really have not talked through that. I think, we've been focused on knocking back the beetles, and like I said in my last slide, kind of almost walking away. And I think part of today is, refocusing some of this too, and starting to think about restoration. So it's something that certainly would concern us.
Awesome. I'm trying to keep up with all the great questions. By the way, folks, you have about 5 more minutes for questions, so keep them coming. These are all awesome. Let's see, I think you had another contact us at the Nantucket Land Bank. We'd be happy to be involved in the regional assessment. And then Bernard Isaacson says, we in New Jersey have developed a pitch pine density management diagram. Might be pretty useful for the regeneration guide you mentioned. We've just started using it as a tool to rate stand risk for southern pine beetle, which you mentioned being of interest. Happy to share. So that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be awesome, Bernard. If you can he attach things, Amanda?
I think it might depend on what version of Zoom you have, but we can definitely make sure that, yes, you can send it. Yeah, hopefully you can drop it into the chat. And if not, send it to Virginia, who will drop her email into the chat in just a moment. And we'll make sure everybody gets all these resources. Let me see. So also from New Jersey, Ken Clark says, hi, Kevin et al. We have used FIA protocols to sample pre and post infestations in 51 stands in New Jersey and would be very interested in sharing this information. And Ken's email, how do, quote, pure pitch pine stands need to be to sustain infestations? Are mixed stands with oaks or other hardwoods also at risk? Yeah,
those are great questions, Ken. And thank you for bringing up that data set. That sounds awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. In the southeast, right? If you have high density pine, there's a very short distance between trees. That if you have a larger distance than that, the beetles won't find that next tree. And so when we started working on southern pine beetle on Long Island, I expected to see these kind of tight stands. And if you had a lot of hardwood in between, and then maybe 20 meters to your next pitch pine, that infestation would just kind of peter out. But that isn't what we see. Some of the stands on Long Island were, they had really large diameter pitch pine, and then just a lot of oak in between those. And so you'd get to the edge of where you'd see, a dead tree from southern pine beetle and think, oh, this is definitely the end of the infestation, but I'm just going to go walk back there anyways. And then boom, that tree would be attacked too. So it seems to me that up here, things are the beetles acting a little bit differently than in the southeast, where if you lose the tightness and the high density in stands, you lose the infestation. Our infestations tend to be maintained even when there's large inter-tree distances among the pine trees.
And a hopefully quick related question, what's the minimum DBH for a host tree, or does it depend like everything in forestry?
Yeah, I mean, I've certainly in the South, I've seen it in probably, 4-inch trees, and higher, but that was on the edge of a really large infestation. So it is a beetle that can successfully reproduce in smaller diameter trees, but you'd be thinking about something, in that suppressed and then intermediate crown class are kind of the common trees that are hit, and then the larger ones too.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions about related pests or parallels to related to other pests. Sandy is asking, I'm guessing that like EAB, it's better to have pitch pines mixed with oaks and other species rather than stands of monoculture pines, which would make it easier for southern pine beetle to infest. So I'd love to hear from Kevin, and I'm also going to pick on Tony D'Amato.
Yeah, I mean, there's work in the Southeast where mixed stands were less susceptible. And there's a couple different mechanisms that have been proposed for that. And, I think up here that would hold too. But like I said, I mean, it's for that last question, it is behaving a little bit differently where it's seems to be able to seek out trees further out than what you see in the Southeast. So I don't know if that same pattern from the South will hold up here. But really, it'd be great to get somebody in research to start looking at the spot dynamics and the spatial relationship of all of these trees in these infestations to give us a better sense of that. I mean, there's a couple of us who feel that feel like what we're seeing is true, but it'd be nice to have data behind that.
Thank you for that. And I'll invite Tony to comment on the EAB side.
Yeah, I guess, I think the real difference between EAB and southern pine beetle is that with EAB, there really doesn't appear to be a silvicultural solution, in terms of, thinning stands or kind of altering host behavior, the behavior of the insect with manipulating stand density. Whereas with southern pine beetle, and certainly Bernard's comment and what EJ will talk about, and certainly John will talk about, there certainly are ways, even in a pure stand, to kind of manipulate that structure to minimize the risk and certainly alter the behavior of the beetle. So EAB remains, they're both challenging, but with EAB, it's kind of, you're really just hoping that the stand has minimal impact, and it's really up to the insect. But with southern pine beetle, there is some interaction between the population structure of that pitch pine and how that influences the beetle's behavior.
Awesome. We are really just about time for break here, but one question that I'd love to finish with, Alexander Amendola says, we have a lot of stands of planted Norway spruce in Connecticut. I've seen and reported infestations in at least one of these stands, Scotch pine as well. I assume these play a role in allowing southern pine beetle to spread into satellite or isolated pitch pine stands. Should we be considering removal of these planted species?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think about that a lot with white pine too, that maybe the beetle is able to just survive in it enough to allow it to spread into areas where, it's like a pathway into some of those isolated pitch pine stands. But I've also, seen it recorded in Norway spruce. I haven't seen it attacking Norway spruce, and that was in Connecticut, and it was salvaged and cut. So yeah, I mean, I think in areas where southern pine beetles in Norway spruce, if it can be, and there's pine around there, it's not a bad idea to suppress it in those trees too, and convert that forest over.
Okay, thank you for that. One thought I will leave us all with is manage the forest, not the insect. That's something that Kevin and Tony and I definitely agree on. So manage the forest, not the insect. In this next segment, for the next hour, we are going to focus on needs and challenges to future action. We're going to start with Jessica Cancelliere from New York, New York State DEC Division of Lands and Forests in the Forest Health Program. So Jess is going to talk a bit about what's going on Long Island and in New York, and share there's a lot more to the story than she can share in 15 minutes, but some of the story of how they have approached managing southern pine beetle in light of the challenges and changes that it's brought to those forests. So Jess, take it away.
All right, thanks, Amanda. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the initial response to southern pine beetle on Long Island back in 2014. And then some of the challenges associated with the program management and just kind of what the whole experience looked like from a programmatic perspective, and maybe how some of the things that we experienced differed from what they've been experiencing in the South for decades. And as you can see, it is a huge collaborative effort. There's a lot of names on this presentation. These are the people that have basically been part of the southern pine beetle response in New York from the beginning, or close to the beginning. Obviously, there are a lot more people, as Kevin highlighted, but these are the major New York players. So southern pine beetle showed up on Long Island in 2014, and it hit hard. As Kevin mentioned earlier, he was talking about these, severe, rapid overstory events, and this was definitely one of those. Long Island, you can see where it is in relation to the state. It juts out into the Atlantic Ocean and is dominated by pitch pine oak forests. And towards the eastern part of the island is the Central Pine Barrens Preserve, which is about 105,000 acres of pine barrens habitat. And it makes up, that whole network of Atlantic coastal pine barrens that extends from New Jersey all the way up to Maine. And so, someone asked the question earlier of, what does spot expansion look like? How many trees are taken out? And Kevin talked about how diverse it was. And that's exactly what we saw on Long Island. Along the south shore of Long Island, really severe, widespread mortality. And I can't underestimate or overestimate how quickly it happened. Trees die in 5 to 6 weeks. So by the time we discovered it there was already probably over 100,000 trees dead. It just happened like that, from the initial reports and the initial signs of stress and mortality to just like suddenly, thousands and thousands of trees dead. And you can kind of see that in the picture on the right. That was Connecticut River State Park, which got hit really hard, almost as hard as Wertheim. And I think the estimation was like over 75% of the pines dead. I think it's actually higher than that at this point. But then if you went towards the North Shore, you saw like a more diffuse population in tiny little spots, sometimes with just 2, 3, 8, 9 trees. So really variable. The map on the left here gives you a little bit better of an idea of where the conifers reside on eastern Long Island. And much of that is what constitutes the Central Pine Barrens Preserve. And that's where most of our work was focused. The other take-home message from this map is just how many partners were involved and just how many land ownerships encompassed the infestation. So we had places like Henry's Hollow State Forest, which the DEC manages, Connecticut State Park, New York State Parks, Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge, Fish and Wildlife Service. We had so many different land ownerships. We had the town of Southampton, Suffolk County. So there were so many partners. And then, we also had all these private land ownerships that are just in the midst of this pitch pine oak matrix. And, their trees were equally as infested. And we're dealing with homeowners who had, all pitch pine in their yard. Those were the only trees they had, and they died within 5 or 6 weeks. And you can imagine if all the trees in your yard died within such a short time, it'd be like a really traumatic event. So there was sort of like a mass migration to Long Island during this time, and all the agencies showed up and all the partners showed up, and we were just trying to get an idea of what the heck was going on and try to understand the extent of the damage. And so one thing that we did right away in DEC is try to develop an incident command system. We've used this for other pests in the past. We find that it's an effective way to manage a program. We started by trying to bring in all the partners in our ICS structure, and that turned out to be a huge challenge. So what you see in front of you is sort of the format that we eventually landed upon. But over in the lower right-hand corner, you can see all the partners that we were working with initially. So we had all the local partners, we had the researchers that we were bringing in from universities, we had federal agencies, state agencies, towns, counties. So eventually we kind of honed in and we whittled down the incident command structure to just the DEC, the Central Pine Barrens, the Long Island Pine Barrens Commission that manages the Central Pine Barrens Preserve. And we brought in Kevin Dodds as our technical specialist, and he was able to also act as a liaison for all of our Southern partners and the people that have managed SPB for decades. And we found this to be really effective, and we basically still use it to this day. I mean, there's not always a real active incident going on, so it goes through phases where it's more active or less active. But I definitely recommend it as a way to make sure that all the boxes are checked early on. So this graphic shows a general timeline from year one, and I wanted to just highlight just how busy we were from, that find in September of 2014 into 2016. We were everywhere all the time, just trying to, like I said, check all the boxes, figure out that we were doing, know that we were doing everything we needed to do. And that included, survey efforts, trying to jump right into suppression right away, monitoring, training staff, and not only tree cutting, but survey and ICS, et cetera. We kind of hit the ground running with research right away because there were just little questions that we needed to answer in order to inform our management. Outreach was a huge deal on Long Island because it's a highly political atmosphere. And again, like I said before, we had 1 million landowners, and there were thousands of people losing trees, and people wanted answers and they wanted to understand what was going on. And then, of course, a big part of our early efforts were prioritization. Where do we need to work first? What's most important? So we established a management plan really early on, and Kevin Dodds helped us with that. We first had a management plan just for Long Island in the first year or two, and then it eventually became the statewide plan that's pictured here. And we laid out our priorities, which included all the things that I have here on the right: prioritization, survey monitoring, stand level prevention. It became quickly apparent because of the severity of the infestation that cut and leave suppression was not going to do it, and that we had to start thinking for the future, and we had to start making these forests more resilient. Long Island was an area in which historic land management hadn't really happened because, in terms of my own memory and history, there was, a big fire that broke out in the 90s, and it made people really uneasy. A lot of people lost homes. There was a lot of damage. People were uneasy with the idea of prescribed fire, and it just, forest management wasn't something that they were accustomed to. And so, there was a lot of work that still needed to be done on the island. We had really, really high density forests, really high basal areas. I mean, in some areas exceeding, 300, 350 square feet per acre. And so prioritization began right away. Molly Hassett and our program was doing a lot of modeling and assigning, the hazard ratings to kind of give us an idea of where we needed to work first. And the areas you see in the map here are state forests. And so we rated them, and we initially used these maps in order to try to put out, try to get some work done in these stands and put these out to bid. We wanted people to come in and cut the trees for us and basically just do a timber sale. That turned out not to work out for various reasons on Long Island. There's no timber market down there. It costs a fortune to get wood off of the island. And we learned very quickly that it wasn't sustainable. So later, these same prioritization maps were used to inform preventative management. So in terms of survey and monitoring, we really needed a lot of help. We had, Forest Health is a small group of people. Most of us are based out of Albany. And then we work within the matrix in DEC in our regional systems. But on Long Island, we only have one regional forester, John Wernett, who you'll hear from later. And so he obviously needed help. And we didn't have a lot of, we had no staff that just permanently resided on Long Island. And it's hard to get down there. So, a big effort early on was to try to bring in people from other places that could help with that initial survey to kind of characterize what was going on. And Jerry Carlson, our Forest Health group leader, was really instrumental at getting the Northeastern Forest Fire Compact involved. And, they have the Forest Health subsection to that group. So we had Forest Health Compact people come and do survey and survey. And then later we had Compact people come and actually do suppression for us as well. And there was even a team of Compact education and outreach people that came and helped us with outreach materials and press releases and media events. Monitoring started right from the beginning. Again, we had the Southern framework to work within, so we had an idea of what we needed to do, and that really helped a lot. We weren't completely starting from scratch. And so we started utilizing their trapping system for monitoring on Long Island very early on, but we did learn quickly that it was different than the South, and we were seeing slightly different patterns. in that monitoring on a smaller spatial scale like Long Island wasn't really providing us with the same predictive information that the South receives from their extensive monitoring program. So Polly Wigan from the Pine Barrens Commission continued trapping for several years after and was able to fill in a lot of information gaps on some of the population biology of the beetle. But the DEC, we stopped trapping on Long Island and started focusing our efforts upstate on early detection. And I showed these two maps because early on you could see we started having small trap catches down in the lower Hudson Valley. But over the years, those trap catches, started moving further north. And as of this day, our furthest northern detection is up in Saratoga County, which is the farthest north black dot that you see on the map on the right there. Cut and leaf suppression, it became clear that that was our only choice. Like I said, the timber sale wasn't successful. The first one we put out to bid, nobody bid on. And so we started doing our own suppression with our own Sawyer teams. And today, we mostly put it out to contract, but we still do have a suppression crew that cuts, and Nate Hudson's on and he manages them, and you can talk to him later if you'd like to. But costs of suppression are quite high. I mean, we average $1,000, $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 an acre to do cut and leave, whereas down south, if you can do a timber sale in order to suppress southern pine beetle, I think you're looking at costs that are much less, with the profit of the timber sale, a couple $100 per acre. We tried various strategies early on. Kevin Dodds was doing research with bark scoring at Wertheim to see if that initiated additional mortality. And that is something that we implemented in the long term. We started doing winter suppression to see if that would also invoke higher mortality. And I did some research on that later on and found out that it wasn't that effective. So we've largely stopped doing it. So it was sort of this combination of taking all the tools that we had from the South and then assessing them and like seeing what worked and seeing what didn't, and then trying to modify that a little bit. Again, like I said, outreach was enormous. So our outreach efforts included things like fact sheets. Again, people were not comfortable with management on Long Island. It's a very populated place, lots of opinions, lots of perspectives. So we would put out fact sheets that just talked about thinning or just talked about suppression. Billboards, this report on the left shows, people would hear something in the news, or they would hear that verbenone could be used to treat southern pine beetle. And then we would be flooded with calls of like, why is the DEC not using verbenone to control southern pine beetle? Why are you not using insecticides? So we put reports like this out on our website to try to inform people of why these strategies were not feasible on a landscape level scale. We made little graphics like this to put on our website just to kind of make it exciting for people and give them good visuals on why management was important and how it could help, cut back on tree loss on Long Island. And then, of course, we had things like the Rocky Point demo forest, which you'll hear probably about later. And the Forest Service funded this, and it's a collaborative effort with them to show different treatment options on a state forest in the middle of all these infestations. So we have control blocks, treatment, thinned blocks, and thin and burned blocks. And that mobile sign was something that the Southern Pine Beetle program worked on, that we actually moved to different parts of the state depending on where we're doing management. And that was taken from the Albany Pine Bush. They were the first ones to do the mobile sign, and that was part of their effort to get the public, supportive of their management efforts. So we were able to kind of borrow ideas from the Pine Bush, who had already been through convincing a large amount of people that forest management was good. We did a ton of research, so we had, people from Dartmouth and UVM, et cetera, like Elizabeth Jamison and Molly Heiss doing like more intensive long-term research. And we were out there just doing these kind of like quick and dirty research projects to answer questions that we needed answered rapidly. Like, how long does it take for trees to die? How long does it take for the color to change? What's the situation with regeneration? How many hazard trees do we have on the side of the road to inform Department of Transportation efforts? Is our winter suppression working? Are we seeing it in other hosts? There were so many questions. And it became apparent that although we know a lot about southern pine beetle, there were subtle differences between the North and the South. And then, of course, restoration efforts started really early on. Some of them were really localized efforts, like the I Love My Park replanting effort at Connecticut State Park where they planted 600 pitch pine trees. My little pop-up didn't come up here, but we actually provided community grants to municipalities on Long Island to mitigate the damage from southern pine beetle. And then, of course, what we're doing now with the Pine Barrens Commission down there is general preventative thinning and prescribed fire, which again, you'll hear about later. And funding came from Forest Service. We tapped into that, the southern pine beetle funding early on. And over time, we would apply for general Forest Service suppression grants each year. And we used a lot of state environmental protection fund money as well. And then, like I said in the last slide, we provided money through EPF to local municipalities and counties as well for support. Shoot, I think that's it. I'm a little over.
You did fabulously. That is a lot of information to convey in such a short amount of time. I think we might have time for a quick clarifying question or two. And I think, and then we'll have EJ go up in just a moment. So if I see any questions pop into the chat, then I will address them. I also want to remind folks from your pre-reading, there's another case study from further south from New Jersey. So Marie Cook was not able to participate today, but she had given a presentation to the compact on New Jersey's effort as well. Let's see. Virginia says, thanks so much for this presentation, Jessica. It is one thing to read about the effects of southern pine beetle and another to see how busy y'all were, paired with hearing, by the time we discovered it, 100,000 trees were already dead.
Yeah. And I do think it'll be easier for land managers in the future, just because I think what happened on Long Island really increased awareness in the region. And I think as a result of it, you know, a lot of people who manage these Pine Barrens ecosystems have been preparing for it ever since. And, you know, people have monitoring traps up, they're watching the numbers. So I think that it's unlikely that it's going to take anyone off guard. You know, not that it took us completely off guard. It wasn't completely off of our radar, but, you know, it happened fast and it came hard. And I think that we at least have, you know, increased the awareness, and I don't foresee it being exactly that same situation again in the Northeast, hopefully.
Yeah, we hope not. I saw two quick clarifying questions sneak in. So first, John Mitchell is asking, can you clarify what winter suppression is? Thinning of trees in the winter before, more questions, before the next generation emerges?
Yeah, so again, Kevin Dodds was our technical advisor, and we met with him and we're brainstorming ideas of you know, new things that we could try. And winter suppression came up as an option because we have this cold winter mortality that SPB are exposed to that might be a tool that we can harness in the north. And so in the south, they cut trees in the spring in order to disrupt, you know, the pheromone communication with the beetles. It's not so much about killing beetles and trees as to like disrupting their emergence and their communication. And so this idea was, rather than doing that, let's cut trees in the winter and try to induce higher mortality in these stands and actually kill some beetles. And like I said, we discontinued it because we found in our research that the number of beetles emerging from felled trees over the winter versus trees that we left standing were actually like not significantly different for a variety of reasons.
Yeah. We're getting more good questions into the chat, but I think in the interest of time, we better let EJ take over. Elizabeth Jamison, EJ, we are so excited that you are here. EJ is a graduated master's student of Tony D'Amato's at UVM and has done phenomenal work connecting with this community of folks that manage pitch pine barrens, including with prescribed fire and mechanical treatment. So EJ, please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that introduction, Amanda. Can you just confirm that you're seeing my PowerPoint full screen there?
Great. Yep.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. As Amanda said, I'm Elizabeth. I go by EJ. And so today I'll be talking about a hazard rating tool for southern pine beetle in northeastern pitch pine barrens. So this work is a result of my master's research at the Rubinstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. And it was funded by the Rubinstein School as well as the U.S. Forest Service Special Technology Development Program. And so before I get started, just want to thank Tony D'Amato and Kevin Dodds for advising and supporting me throughout this project, as well as Amanda and Virginia for facilitating this workshop. And then also just wanted to let you know that this research is being published in the journal Agricultural and Forest Entomology. So I'll be sure to share that paper hot off the press once it's ready. So just for a quick overview, let me get my pointer going here. So just for a quick overview here, I'll just start with an introduction about hazard rating and then move on to our methods, and then finally talk about the model as well as its applications. So hazard rating is a tool that can be used to determine where forest pest management could be both most needed and most effective. And so it's not predicting when or if damage will occur, but it identifies conditions in which infestations are most likely to occur. And so therefore it lets us understand and actually quantify this relationship between forest conditions and pest activity. And so then that information can be used to identify and prioritize highly susceptible stands or high hazard stands for prevention management. And if you're interested in reading more about this, Hicks et al. 1987 is a really great resource and talks about southern pine beetle specifically. So hazard rating has been used extensively in southeastern pine forests to reduce southern pine beetle damage. And here is a U.S. Forest Service 2012 National Insect Disease and Risk Map that depicts southern pine beetle hazard by county. So these yellow colors indicate low hazard and that brown color indicates high hazard. So this is showing the percent of each county rated as moderate or high hazard. And as you can see, the northern extent of this kind of stops in New Jersey, and hazard rating has been applied further north than that. But what we wanted to do is to develop a hazard rating model calibrated specifically for southern pine beetle in northeastern pitch pine forests. And we're hoping that this tool can be applied to help reduce damage in this region, therefore protecting this ecologically and culturally important landscape. So in order to do this, in order to build this model, we collected stand inventory data from the Long Island pine barrens, and we chose Long Island because it was the furthest north example of pine barrens that had both infested and uninfested forests. And so in addition to the stands we sampled, the New York State DEC provided 2018 to 2019 southern pine beetle survey and treatment data, which was super important for this project. So I want to thank them so much for that. So here's a map showing the location of those stands. That's these green dots with the darker green dots corresponding to higher basal areas. And then the southern pine beetle spots are shown in these brown dots. And overall, we sampled 117 stands, 78 of which were infested. So we used this data to create a hazard rating model, which is the equation shown here. And sorry for throwing up a statistical equation. So it's a logistic regression. So this output over here is corresponding to probability that a stand is infested. And this, of all the different forest variables we looked at, we found it to be best predicted by 3 variables, which I'll call hazard predictors. And these are pitch pine basal area, previous year southern pine beetle spots nearby, and soil texture. And so, as I said, this over here statistically corresponds to a probability that a stand is infested, but within the forestry world, actual probability corresponds more to the term risk. And that factor encompasses a variety of things, including southern pine beetle populations. But we are only looking at stand conditions. So this interpretation more appropriately corresponds to a hazard rating. So hazard ratings close to 0 correspond to low stand susceptibility, while hazard ratings closer to 1 correspond to high susceptibility to infestation or high hazard stand. So this figure is showing the outputs of this model, the predictions of this hazard rating model, and it is showing that predicted across previous year southern pine beetle activity here on the X by soil texture, with this solid line corresponding to sandy soil and this dotted line corresponding to loamy soil, as well as pitch pine basal area, with the blue corresponding to lower basal areas and the brown corresponding to higher basal areas. So you can see, looking at these predictions, we're seeing that hazard ratings increase with more southern pine beetle activity nearby on sandy soil here in the solid line and in stands that have a higher pitch pine basal area. So why might this be? And you've heard a lot about this already today. But similar variables to those we are using have also been used in hazard rating models developed for the Southeast. And so we have a pretty good idea as to why this might be. And so first, let's talk about these 2 hazard predictors that land managers can't really do much to influence, and that is previous year southern pine beetle activity as well as soil texture. So for the southern pine beetle activity, as you might expect, that had a really big impact on a stand's hazard. And that's because this variable is actually capturing a bit of that risk factor. So we use the data provided by the DEC to count the number of southern pine beetle spots within 690 meters of our sample stands. And we were talking about this a bit earlier with some of the questions that Kevin had, but that number 690 meters has previously been cited by Turchin and Thione 1993 as the distance that approximately half of southern pine beetle individuals are able to disperse in a given year. So that's where that number comes from. And while doing my master's research, I kind of got excited about this ability to spatially model beetle activity. I was like, oh, maybe I can throw this in. And no, that is like a whole other master's project. So would be something really cool to learn more about. And so, as you might expect, when neighboring stands had a lot of these southern pine beetle spots, those source populations were more likely to infest a stand. So more southern pine beetle activity leads to a higher probability of that stand becoming infested. So then this next hazard predictor, it's a bit more complicated, and that's probably because it's capturing multiple factors. So we found that stands on loamy soils were less susceptible to infestation than stands on sandy soils. And first, that might be explained by the fact that loamy soil has a higher water availability than sandy soil, which could actually be improving pitch pine's defensive capabilities, its ability to like pitch out those invading beetles. And then second, the presence of more hardwoods on the loamy soil could actually be disrupting southern pine beetle dispersal and spot initiation, which we talked a bit about earlier. And so of all of our predictors though, pitch pine basal area is the hazard predictor that is most easily influenced by land managers. And as I'm sure you're familiar with by now, southern pine beetle has caused a lot of problems in southeastern forests. And so to reduce impact in those southeastern forests, it's generally recommended that basal areas be reduced to below 80 square feet per acre. And so basal area reduction is effective against southern pine beetle for three primary reasons. So first, it reduces competition for resources between those trees and increases individual tree vigor and their ability to defend against invading beetles. Second, removing the pine trees directly decreases the amount of habitat available for the beetle. And then third, opening the canopy up and increasing the spacing between trees can actually disrupt the pheromones that southern pine beetle uses to coordinate mass aggregates. So this figure here is just depicting this relationship. As stand density increases, so does insect and disease impacts. Okay, so that's an overview of the model. So let's take a look at how this could be applied. So this figure is showing hazard ratings at all combinations of pitch pine basal area here on the x-axis and on loamy soil here on the left panel and sandy soil here on the right panel. And then we have previous year southern pine beetle spots here on the y-axis. So these brown colors corresponding to high hazard, blue corresponding to low hazard. So let's say that we know that a stand is growing on sandy soil. So we'll go over to this panel here. We say it has about 15 square meters per hectare of pitch pine basal area, and there were 2 southern pine beetle spots nearby last year. And so that would tell us that we have a moderate hazard stand. So next, I just kind of want to run through an example of how that information could be used to inform management decisions. So say we have 3 stands here and we want to assess their relative hazard ratings. The first thing we need to do is acquire data for all 3 of these predictors. So pitch pine basal area can be acquired from stand sampling. The spot data can be obtained from annual federal and state aerial insect and disease surveys. And then soil texture could either be determined in the field or actually downloaded from the USDA's Surgo online database. Okay, so let's get into these 3 stands. Let's say this first hypothetical stand, has a pitch pine basal area of 10 square meters per hectare. There were no southern pine beetle spots nearby last year, and the soil texture is loam. And so from this menu here, we actually select this value 0 corresponding to loam. And so this hazard rating model tells us that the stand has a hazard rating of 0.09. This next hypothetical stand, say it has a pitch pine basal area of 15 square meters per hectare. There were also no southern pine beetle spots nearby, but this one is growing on sand. So selecting 1.65, and that gives us a hazard rating of 0.43. Last stand has a pitch pine basal area of 20 square meters per hectare. There were 3 spots nearby this stand last year, and it's also growing on sand. So that results in a hazard rating of 0.17. So looking at the relative hazard ratings, we can see that stand 3 should be our first priority for prevention management to reduce those hazardous conditions. And then correcting hazardous conditions like those in stand 3 actually has pretty serious implications for landscape scale susceptibility to southern pine beetle. So let's pretend that this grid here is a landscape of a pitch pine forest, and currently there's no southern pine beetle present. But this high hazard stand here is providing optimal habitat for the beetle. So if southern pine beetle is to arrive on the landscape, it could persist at low levels in this high hazard stand. And then if environmental conditions switch to be really favorable of southern pine beetle, this high hazard stand could facilitate an outbreak that spreads into neighboring stands. And then over time, as we've seen many times, this outbreak can actually spread across the landscape and even could begin to impact stands that don't seem particularly susceptible. So by eliminating hazardous conditions in this high hazard stand, we can actually reduce the chance of serious outbreak occurring across the landscape. So our model was telling us that stands with pitch pine basal areas less than 15 square meters per hectare were less likely to be infested with southern pine beetle. That's what this line here is showing. So therefore, we identified 15 square meters per hectare, or about 65 square feet per acre, as a density target for reducing southern pine beetle susceptibility in northeastern pitch pine forests. And the cool thing about that is the management practices such as burning and thinning that are effective in reducing pitch pine basal area on the Pine Barrens landscape has been there for thousands of years. And so in addition to reducing southern pine beetle susceptibility, they have shown to reduce crown fire risk, promote habitat that is critical for biodiversity, and to restore pitch pine dominance. So we therefore concluded that pitch pine barrens can be managed both to improve resilience to future threats like southern pine beetle and to preserve historic ecological conditions. So that's all I have for you. Thanks so much for listening. I want to thank Tony and Kevin again, and the Silviculture and Applied Forest Ecology Lab at UVM for supporting this project, and Amanda and Virginia for coordinating this awesome workshop. So I can take any questions you all have now.
Outstanding job, EJ. So exciting to see that. And sorry we had such limited time for you, but thank you for conveying all your work so effectively and concisely. We already have a question. Justin is asking, before southern pine beetle was recognized as a threat to pitch pine habitats, land managers were already concerned about recruitment and habitat persistence and were doing mechanical thinning and prescribed fire. How has this work contributed to hazard risk and resilience of these habitats?
Great question. Yeah, so I think any of that work that has been, using burning and thinning to reduce stand density has made these stands less susceptible to southern pine beetle. And I would expect that going forward, as we may see it expand further north, that these stands that have historically been managed for wildlife or any other objectives are less likely to experience severe impacts from the beetle.
Great. And while we wait for additional questions to come in, I'll just point people toward, Logan shared a link to the nice handout that EJ prepared. So in case you want to revisit some of the themes that she touched on in her presentation, check out that handout, which you were supposed to read before you came. But Sandy is asking, how does prescribed fire reduce southern pine beetle risk exactly?
Yeah, another good question. And I think you'll hear more about this later. But in general, when we're burning these landscapes, it is reducing the amount of basal area that is either growing up into new trees or actually killing some trees. So fire is directly killing trees, which is going to reduce the overall basal area. And then also that fire may also be promoting pitch pine, because pitch pine is highly, highly adapted to thrive in ecosystems that are experiencing fire. So that's kind of where that overlap comes through.
Awesome, thanks. So Jake is asking, he says, excellent presentation. Are you or others aware of carbon sequestration literature specific to pitch pine and treatments similar to southern pine beetle recommendations? The greatest pushback I see from the public on the Cape is related to simplified understanding of climate change and carbon sequestration. Treatments should be good to improve vigor, resilience, and sequestration, but explicitly linking that in outreach will benefit us all. So it's more of a comment than a question, but love to hear you echo your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's something we've actually talked a lot about. And it's so interesting because, you know, carbon management has kind of emerged as a really hot topic in the forestry world. But I mean, I kind of think, you know, the pine barrens are kind of the poster child for we need multiple objectives, we need multiple reasons for managing the land, and carbon sequestration cannot just be the only thing, right? So these landscapes that have few trees are probably not holding that much carbon in them, but they're providing critical habitat. And so I think, you know, being aware that we need to evaluate these forests via other metrics aside from just carbon is very important. And I guess something that these questions are also alluding to is that, you know, in these low basal area forests dominated by pitch pine, you know, pitch pine is the primary species there. And so theoretically, as my model was even saying, they are inherently more susceptible to infestation because there's pitch pine there. So theoretically, if we got rid of all the pitch pine, the model would say, great, you're gonna have, you know, no southern pine beetle here. But that clearly does not align with our management objectives. We want to keep pitch pine in the landscape, and I think we can do it in a way that you can, you know, manage for different mosaics of different pitch pine basal areas. Maybe we have some oak in this area. And so by using that lens to look at the landscape rather than strictly carbon or strictly southern pine beetle, we can, you know, create more biodiversity and landscape scale heterogeneity in the woods.
Probably the last comment, let's see, Brian is sharing, in Massachusetts, I also remind people that if a dense pitch pine forest is not managed and becomes infested by southern pine beetle, we are likely to see widespread mortality and potentially catastrophic wildfire, which will release far more carbon than any of our management. So excellent point, Brian. Thank you for that. The next segment, we are very excited to have John Nowak, who is an entomologist with the USDA Forest Service Southern Region Forest Health Protection. So John is going to give us a brief presentation on thinning, prescribed fire, southern pine beetle, and a cost share program that he's been involved with in the Southeast. We'll have a brief bit of time for Q&A before our kind of synthesis exercise. So John, take it away.
Okay, great. Thanks, Amanda. Appreciate it. Move my face off the screen here. As Amanda mentioned, I manage the Southern Pine Beetle Prevention Program for the Southern Region. The Southern Region is from Virginia to Florida over to Oklahoma and Texas, so 13 states. And we've had this program in the Southern United States since 2003. After our last major outbreak occurred in the Southern Appalachian Mountains, there was a big push by Congress to have some type of prevention program in the South. We've dealt with southern pine beetle in the southern U.S. for forever, from the 30s, 40s, 50s, mostly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. We had huge southern pine beetle outbreaks, but this prevention program started in 2003. And it's administered by Forest Health Protection, but over the years it's been implemented on 12 national forests and 13 southern states. Generally, each year we have between 5 and 7 national forests that participate, and up to 10 or 11 states participate. But over the years, 12 national forests and 13 states have done some work with this program. Basic tenet of this program is just increasing forest resiliency through good forest management. Treatments do include forest thinning, prescribed fire, and restoring native pine forest. Since the program started, about 1.3 million acres have been treated across the southern U.S. At an average of $91 an acre, and more than 16,000 landowners and loggers have directly participated in this program. And I should say right up front, I acknowledge the fact that in the southern U.S., our market conditions are likely better than what you do have in the Northeast. And also our social political climate is more conducive to doing some of these treatments. Although we do have more of an issue with both of those things when we're trying to do work on national forest land. So we're doing on state and private land, we have less concern from a political social political aspect, and also the market conditions for state and private is actually better than what it is for national forests. We've run into some roadblocks trying to implement southern pine beetle management on national forest in the South, particularly in the past couple of years. So at the beginning of this program, a number of us with the U.S. Forest Service and with states got together and talked about, there was a huge chunk of money in the beginning, particularly for this program. And so there were several of us that got together, state, federal partners, and talked about which direction this program should go. And it was decided that the majority of the funding should go to on-the-ground accomplishments, trying to get work done that would make an impact in reducing forest susceptibility to southern pine beetle. And in the South, as I'm sure it's the same in the Northeast, interacting with landowners is important. If you don't engage with small private landowners and they're not participating in the program, there's no way you're going to have a landscape level impact. So that was a main focus of the program from the beginning. And really good southern pine beetle management is just forestry 101 stuff. And I'll talk more about that, but whatever the reason is that you're managing your forest, doing it the right way is good for southern pine beetle management as well. And then we're dealing with 13 different states and 12 national forests. And so we wanted each one of those entities to kind of manage make their own program. The national forests are all kind of the same, but with the state programs, we wanted each one of those states to kind of have flexibility in managing the programs. There was more differences between state programs in 2003 than there are now. There's been kind of a convergence of the way states manage their programs over the years, what works and what doesn't. And so, as I mentioned, good forest management is really whatever the reason you're doing it for, if it's wildlife habitat or reduced fire risk, better aesthetics, whatever, is good for southern pine beetle. And so these two stands, the top left stand is in Arkansas on the Ouachita National Forest. It's a shortleaf pine, chalky blue stem stand. On the bottom right-hand corner is a longleaf pine stand in Florida. And these stands, even though they're thousands of miles apart, they have some basic characteristics that are the same. You know, it's the right tree species for the site. Low intensity, frequent fire is part of the equation. Low stand density, as EJ mentioned, is a big factor. Less than 80 square feet of basal area, at least immediately following the thinning. And we usually recommend thinning once a stand reaches 120 square feet of basal area. So thin it back to 80 square feet. These stands also have good, healthy diameter growth, good live pound ratio, and adequate tree spacing. And there was some decent, good discussion about the overall basal area. I think I saw Polly put in the chat that we really think about it from a total basal area standpoint, whether it's a pure pine stand or a mixed hardwood pine stand. I really think about it more from the openness of that stand as important. And that the longer I've been in this position, the more I've thought that really the openness of the stand is the key ingredient. Not so much the host vigor is important, but I really think having that open airflow stand, sunlight hitting, being able to hit the vegetation is important from being able to disrupt the pheromone plume standpoint. So I think that's more important, the openness of the stand, than having hardwoods in there to the green leaf volatiles and those kind of things, or just having that open stand is important. And I would definitely make the argument that shortleaf pine stand on the left, the longleaf pine stand, and the pitch pine stands, this picture from Long Island up on the top right here. All these stands have similar characteristics, and the good forest management in those stands is really the same type of formula. Low intensity fire, keeping the stands open, thinning when you should. So as part of the Southern Pine Beetle Prevention Program, we have several treatments that states can choose from as part of their program. First thinning is what we encourage to be the primary treatment, and that includes a logger incentive program, which I'll talk more about here in a minute. Pre-commercial thinning or non-commercial thinning before the trees are merchantable, but you know you're going to have a dense stand in the future, and so we've encouraged some cost sharing in these pre-commercial thinning or non-commercial stands or forests. Putting the right tree species on the right site, and in the south, in some areas, particularly in the coastal plain, longleaf pine is a preferred tree species to plant because it's less susceptible to southern pine beetle, and it's the right tree species for certain sites. In the northern part of our region, in Arkansas, Tennessee, some parts of North Carolina, shortleaf pine may be the more appropriate tree species, even though it is susceptible to southern pine beetle, but it's the right tree for the right site. And then we have also allowed planting loblolly pine, but just at lower densities than what has traditionally been done in the past, in hopes that you can delay the time when thinning is needed. And prescribed fire has also been part of the program since it started in 2003. Although in 2003, we were less excited about prescribed fire than we are now. I think the science has evolved over that time period. That does show that prescribed fire as part of good forest management is also good for southern pine beetle. And I think I saw in the chat, why is prescribed fire important? And I can't remember if that was answered or not, but from a southern pine beetle perspective, I would think about it more as like opening that stand up, reducing that mid-story competition, and also just reducing competition, but also more importantly, opening the stand up for increased airflow in the stand, particularly if you do low intensity fire on a frequent basis. And EJ, I think, talked about this before, but I wanted to reiterate it. You know, I always try to, when I give a presentation to stakeholders, to talk about the other benefits of these types of treatments. You know, you're reducing the fire risk, you're improving wildlife habitat, and that includes pollinators. There's some good studies that have come out recently that show that a better managed stand, a more open stand, has increased levels of pollinators using those types of forests. And then improved aesthetics or walkability or all those kind of things. I'd rather spend a day in a wide open pine stand than one that was chock full of other, you know, just overrun with competition. And so a large part of what this program has been based upon is cost share with landowners through this, which are run through the state forestry agencies. So we give funding to state forestry agencies, and they all have a cost share program within their state. And some basic parts of the cost share programs are that we have encouraged the use of hazard maps to prioritize where treatments occur in a state. The landowner generally pays for 50% of the treatment. So just the way the grants are set up, the state has to match the federal dollar. So in a lot of cases, the landowner ends up paying for 50% of the treatment, and the state pays for 50%. So it's a one-to-one match. And in cases where we're able to pay more than 50%, there has been greater participation in the cost share, as you would expect. And in all these treatments, all the thousands of treatments that have been done through this program, the forester is involved in selecting which stands should be treated and whether or not that stand meets the criteria of the program. And then a forester goes back and meets with the landowner and makes sure that the treatment was done to the specifications of the program. And I really like that aspect of the program because it allows the landowner to interact with a professional to talk about forest management and hopefully build that relationship. And so that it's not just a one-time treatment, but it's something that the landowner will come back to that forester and ask questions about how they should manage their stands to meet their objectives. So I really like that aspect of it. And then we've tried to target stands or forest areas that wouldn't have otherwise be thinned. In a lot of cases, that's due to market conditions. So where we have poor markets, or where a landowner only owns 20 acres, oftentimes they have difficulty getting the logger to come in and thin their 20 acres. So in a lot of cases, states have really targeted those smaller landowners, trying to prioritize when they sign up those smaller landowners, or in one particular case in the logger incentive program. And I told you I'd talk a little bit more about this. Some states, not all states, have used what we call the logger incentive program. Virginia is a really great example. Arkansas, Texas, Mississippi have used this at some point, but Virginia has used this for the past decade or so. And basically what it does, instead of having a cost share with the landowner, we're paying a logger a flat rate to do the thinning treatment. And so that kind of covers their cost of moving their heavy equipment onto the site and being able to do the work on a smaller landowner. Oftentimes is what we find is, like I said, that 20-acre landowner may have a real difficulty getting a logger to get their equipment over there and do the thinning job. And we've had some success with this logger incentive program, and more so where we've asked landowners to kind of bundle with their neighbor or their next door person down the road that wants to do the same type of treatment, bundle those types of treatments together, and a logger is more likely to come to a general area and not have to move their equipment long distances. And I also like this aspect of the program because it helps maintain that forestry infrastructure in a local area. You lose the loggers, there's no one there to do the work in an area. It's really hard to get the work accomplished. So I like that aspect of the funding not going necessarily to the landowner, but to the logger, who oftentimes is operating on kind of a pretty thin margin of profitability. And early on, we developed some general guidelines. I generally don't talk about this, but I thought since you all were talking about what the future may hold for a regional program, we've limited individual landowners to $10,000 in a given year of cost share. We really wanted to prioritize work in moderate to high hazard areas, and EJ showed those hazard maps earlier, and I'm going to show you some that we use here in the South. And thinning is the preferred practice. I really think you get the most bang for your buck when you're dealing with southern pine beetle prevention. Thinning is really the preferred practice, although those other practices are also important. And then early on, we asked the states provide a GPS point for where they did the work, so we can kind of evaluate where most of the work has been done over the years. This was our first attempt at a hazard map. I think this was done in 2006, 2007. And on the left is Georgia, on the right is Eastern Texas. And where you see the red on the map there is kind of the higher hazard areas. And I would bet the red there are the national forests in East Texas, and also over here in Central Georgia as well. And so this is a 240 meter resolution, and 240 meter resolution is equivalent to about 12 acres. So it's not really super fine resolution, but it gives you an idea of where the highest hazard areas are on a larger scale. And if you zoom into these particular areas, you can kind of zoom into the stand level. So an individual owner pattern shows up. And the National Forest use this kind of pixelated maps more so than the states do, as some of their layers for when they're deciding which stands they should treat. The states, on the other hand, like this map better. This took the pixelated areas and blew it up to the county level. And this is the map that EJ showed at the beginning of her presentation, where it kind of shows which counties the highest hazard is in. And the states like this better because they can say, we're going to focus our cost share in these 10 counties, or these 10 counties are going to have a higher priority than counties that are in the lower hazard, like in the yellow. But they really, a lot of the states will focus on the dark brown counties the most. A really great example of that is also from Virginia, although other states like Florida, Texas, Georgia will all use these maps to prioritize where the funding goes. And as funding has gotten tighter over the years, these maps have become more important.
John, forgive me for cutting in, but we're just about out of time here. I wonder if you might be able to wrap up.
That was it.
Yay, well done.
I was just going to show you this where the dots are, where all the treatments have occurred. And this is a story map that you can Google if you want to know more about the program.
Very cool. Thank you so much for that, John. I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, but it was all really excellent information. I mean, asking you to talk about everything that the South has learned in 15 minutes is really a tall order. So thank you. Please join us in a virtual round of applause for all of our speakers, presenters, facilitators, everybody who's doing a really great job of learning, studying, and doing something to try to address southern pine beetle in our pitch pine forests. So thank you, everybody.